Hello, everybody, and welcome to the State of State Schools podcast. I'm your host, John Stamper, Christian author, former homeschooler, and former public school teacher. If you're a homeschool family looking for information, resources, or encouragement, or if you want to pull back the curtain and know what's really going on inside public schools, this podcast is for you. Thanks for listening. Let's get started. All right, it is finally March. Springtime is right around the corner. I hope everyone is able to get outside and enjoy that warm weather. In this episode, I want to discuss just a couple topics. First of all, Illinois House Bill 2827, known as the Homeschool Act. And I want to discuss a couple of President Trump's education policies. First of all, the Illinois House Bill 2827 was introduced on February 6, 2025, just about a month ago. And this bill seeks to establish what's known as the Homeschool Act, introducing new requirements and oversight for homeschooling families in Illinois. Now, while this is an Illinois bill, the language, the requirements, the oversight that's included is very common across the country. You will see this in other state bills as well. So whether you live in Illinois or not, you're going to want to pay attention to what's happening here. The current status of this bill, as of February 14th, it's been assigned to the House Rules Committee and awaits further hearings. So it's not a law yet. It still has a ways to go. The introduction of this bill has sparked debate among lawmakers, homeschooling families, and educational organizations over balancing child welfare with parental rights and educational freedom. My take as a Christian, a father, a husband, a former homeschooler, and a former public school teacher, my take is that no state agency or public school district should have any involvement or control over what I teach my own children, how I teach them, when or where I teach them. And the public school system especially is in no position to dictate how or what homeschool families teach their children. When it comes to public school performance versus homeschool performance, Paul Dragu of The New American recently reported, quote, "There are 0 academic subjects in which more than half of America's public education students are proficient." That's according to the government's own assessment, the nation's report card, end quote. So this idea that the public schools or state agencies who are performing much worse than homeschoolers, that they're to be the overseers of homeschool education, that's like a high school JV basketball player telling Michael Jordan how to play basketball. It's ridiculous. The majority of homeschoolers, I think, homeschool because they want to pass on their values, morals, and faith to their children. And they have 0 confidence in the public school system to do that. Or they don't want the state to be involved in how they raise and educate their own children. So, if any of this describes you, then you will not want to support this Illinois bill or any other bills like it because it would increase regulation and eat away at your personal liberties. But not all homeschoolers are the same. There are some homeschoolers out there who like the public schools. They want the state or federal government to pay for their kids to go to school or pay for their homeschool curriculum. But really, it's their neighbors being forced to pay for it. But for one reason or another, these homeschool families have to homeschool. Now, this group of homeschoolers would probably support a bill like this, unfortunately. So one of my goals is to reach that group that supports the government schools and supports this socialist practice of the government taking money from others and giving it to you. And I want to show this group that, 1, it's not the state's responsibility to educate children. 2, it's immoral to force other people to pay for your education or your child's education. And 3, you don't want the government controlling something so sacred and so precious as the upbringing and education of your children, because they do a really bad job historically. Now, let's talk about what's in the Illinois House Bill 2827, the Homeschool Act, and what would happen if it passes. First of all, there would be annual notification starting on August 1st, 2026, next year, if it passes. Homeschooling parents must submit a homeschool declaration form annually to their local public school districts. So homeschool families would have to report to the local public school district. Failure to comply would result in the child being considered truant. Now, if the declaration form has not been completed after 10 days of the deadline or after 10 days of withdrawing a student from a public school, both the parents and the student would be considered truant. Then, truancy officers would try to get a hold of the family at least 3 times, urging them to submit their form. And if the form is still not submitted, the parents or the homeschool administrators would be subject to truancy hearings. And then the last step would be that the parents are fined and could be arrested and sent to jail for up to 30 days. This is what you'd be subjected to if this bill passes, whether you support the bill or not. Now, what if the parents are in jail for 30 days, let's say, it gets to that point? What happens then to the children? Do they stay home alone? Do they stay with a family member? Or does a state agency come and take them? Not to mention, that parent would likely lose their job while in jail. And then what? Does the family lose their house? Who knows? Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what's the big deal? It's just a form with some personal information on it. Well, other than the state having proven for decades how incompetent it is at educating children, let's talk about what happens after the declaration form is submitted. Educational portfolios. Parents would be required to maintain an educational portfolio documenting their child's academic progress, which then local public school officials can request and review at any time. So again, the local public school officials are reviewing the homeschool parents and their children. So the parents and the children are under the authority of the public school officials, even though they're homeschoolers. And review, what are they going to review? So the public school officials are going to review my child? Aren't I their teacher as their parent? Why does the public school have to review them? I'm the one teaching them. So for starters, if you submitted the form to them, now you're on the list and they have to check up on you, on your parenting skills, on your teaching skills. And what happens in a review? What if the public school official says, hey, your child isn't learning what they're supposed to be learning? Where's all the critical race theory? Where's all the LGBTQ plus diversity inclusion curriculum? Where's the social emotional learning? Will parents then be reported for neglecting their child's education? Who knows? So what this really means is you can homeschool as long as you're under the control, supervision, and authority of the local public schools. Next up, administrator qualifications. That's qualifications for parents if they're the homeschoolers. This is about parent qualifications. So parents, you have to be qualified to teach your own children, and the state gets to set up those standards, those qualification standards. The state will determine if a parent is qualified or not. Homeschool administrators must possess a high school diploma or its equivalent. So what this really means is only those parents who've been trained by the government school system will be deemed qualified, quote unquote, to raise and teach their own children. So you can teach your own kids, but only if you meet their criteria. Next up, health compliance is in this bill. Well, that sounds nice. We want healthy kids, right? Well, the bill says that homeschooled children seeking to participate in public school activities must provide proof of required immunizations and health examinations or a signed certificate of religious exemption. Now, what's interesting is that this bill encourages local public schools to reach out to homeschool families in their area. Invite them into the building, share resources, share curriculum, invite them to participate in fun activities. It sounds nice and neighborly, but there's always a catch. In order for any homeschooler to use the public school facility, those homeschooled children must first get all the mandatory vaccinations. Again, this is another example of control and manipulation. This is not what freedom looks like. Next up is data reporting is in this bill. Regional education offices are tasked with collecting data on homeschooled children and reporting annually to the state superintendent of education. So this means all of your child's personal information and yours will be scrutinized and measured to see if you're teaching them the quote unquote required curriculum. consistent with the state standards. Now, you may think, so what? They can have my data. I have nothing to hide. But basically, public schools want to collect and report data to know whether or not homeschool families are implementing the exact same curriculum that's been taught in the public schools. And for people like me who will not be following the public school model with my children, well, then what will the state say about us? So, to sum it up, supporters of the bill argue that the current laws do not adequately protect homeschool children. That's an important phrase. The laws don't adequately protect homeschooled children from who? From their parents? Emphasizing the need for better oversight to ensure a safe and sufficient education. See, the default position of the state is that children are not safe at home and that parents, as a whole, can't be trusted. That may sound harsh, and you may not agree with that if it's phrased that way, but that's why this bill and bills like it choose to use nice sounding phrases and warm, fuzzy words like safe and sufficient, so people will accept it easier. I find the whole thing to be ridiculous, honestly, coming from the state and public schools, given that homeschoolers outscore and outperform their public school peers in every way that you can measure. But these failing government institutions want to oversee and regulate the homeschool families, the ones who are running laps around them? I don't think so. Now, I want to finish this story with some fun facts. The U.S. Constitution does not address education. Coincidentally, the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution reads, quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people," end quote. Don't forget about that last little phrase, or to the people. The 1973 Supreme Court case of Rodriguez versus the San Antonio Independent School District ruled that education is not a fundamental right protected by the Constitution. And that precedent has not been challenged in the 52 years since. So, since education is not explicitly delegated to the U.S. government, that means the federal DOE, which was founded in 1979 under Jimmy Carter, is unconstitutional. Education is instead reserved to the states, which means that states can have their own DOE, at least it would be constitutional for them to have their own DOE. But the better option, in my opinion, would be to reserve the power of education to the people, just like the 10th Amendment says. But what does that mean practically? What does that look like? Does that mean everyone becomes a homeschooler? Or does everyone stop learning and our society becomes completely illiterate and uneducated? No, of course not. Now, let me point out that at the end of the 19th century, 1800s, literacy rates in America were higher than they are right now. How were people so well educated without all the money and technology and resources that we have now? Well, keep in mind, this was before humanists like Horace Mann and John Dewey designed our current public school system. Now, I've done an episode on the history of our public school system already, but we always had public schools here in America. They just weren't publicly funded, government-controlled public schools like the ones we have now. The federal and state governments had little to no involvement in education until Horace Mann came back from Germany and implemented their compulsory attendance laws in Massachusetts in 1852. Up until that point, education was totally up to the parents, and parents had to pay for their kids to go to school. And if parents couldn't afford it, which happens, the church would help. Or students could apply for scholarships or apprenticeships, or a number of charities could help. But now, your neighbors, who may or may not have children and may or may not even support the public schools, they're forced to pay for your child's education. My child's education if I send them to a public school system. That's a socialist system, forced redistribution of wealth. And that's the system we currently have, but we're told it's for the common good. Well, just take a look at the nation's report card and you'll see all the quote-unquote good that's coming out of our public schools. We're also told that free K-12 education is a constitutionally protected right, but I just mentioned the Supreme Court case that says it's not. So, I say all this and go back to the Illinois House Bill 2827, known as the Homeschool Act, and reiterate that education, in my opinion, should be reserved to the people. All education, but especially homeschooling. And if and when the state or federal government intervenes, their control and influence will only get bigger, it will only get more expensive, while the quality of that education goes down. Next, I wanted to address a few of President Trump's education policies, specifically regarding school choice and woke indoctrination. I know there's a lot of excitement among conservatives, what with the DOE possibly being abolished, but there's also a lot of questions as to how everything will shake out. President Trump has stated very strongly that he wants to expand school choice. He ran on that, whether through grants, vouchers, or ESAs. Universal school choice is seen by most Trump supporters as a great thing, as a conservative approach to education. And I think it's seen that way because it's sort of an acknowledgement that our public school system is not good. And quote unquote, school choice is seen as the common sense alternative to public schools. It's like saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So it's kind of like if the left-wing liberal teachers unions hate school choice, which they do, then as a conservative, that means I must love school choice. But that's not exactly the case. Public schools don't like school choice simply because it takes away their funding. That's the core issue, funding. And it's important to remember that. Now, it's a liberal value to want and support government funding, government spending, big government. But it's a conservative value to not want those things, to not want government handouts. You don't want a big government. Conservatives want a small government. So the fact that conservatives are so gung-ho over school choice, which is just another government subsidy program for education, proves how misunderstood and misrepresented the school choice movement really is. So let me ask this. What makes public schools public? Well, they're public for the same reason that private schools are private. It's about funding. We're back to that funding issue. Public schools are publicly funded with tax dollars, and private schools are privately funded by individual families or churches or private institutions. That is, unless those private schools start to accept vouchers or any school choice funds, then they would become just as publicly funded as your local public schools. So, since one of the defining characteristics of public schools is that they're publicly funded, then what do you call a private school that is also publicly funded? Are they still private? What do you call a homeschool family whose curriculum is publicly funded with vouchers or ESAs? I would call them a government-funded, government-controlled school. Why? Because government oversight and government regulation always follows public funds. It has to, by law. And government oversight isn't necessarily a bad thing because we should know where our taxes are going and what the government is doing with our money. There should be accountability. So we really don't want there to be school choice funds without government regulations attached, because if that were the case, if there was no oversight, what would stop private schools or homeschool families from taking those school choice funds and, say, buying new cars or taking vacations with it? If there's no government oversight, that's exactly what could happen. So oversight is necessary. And that's exactly why private schools and homeschool families who value liberty should not accept school choice funds or even support the school choice movement, because it's guaranteed to come with government control. History proves this to be the case. So, since I am not a school choice advocate, does that make me a liberal? Well, let me put it this way. If school choice will grow the government, raise educational costs like it did in Arizona, raise property taxes, and take away my personal freedoms, does that sound like a conservative approach or a liberal approach? I'd say that school choice is actually a socialist or communist idea because it relies upon the forced financial contribution of other people and the redistribution of public funds. That's not conservative, and it's not even a Christian ideal. It's legalized plundering. And don't forget, the UN's education wing, UNESCO, has been pushing school choice for years explicitly as a way to gain control of private schools and homeschoolers, because these globalists know that government funding is how they can gain control. Now, let's move on to Trump's efforts to get rid of woke indoctrination in schools and universities. Now, I know firsthand that public schools across the country have absolutely been celebrating and incentivizing homosexuality and transgenderism, pushing critical race theory, discriminating against Christianity and white heterosexual males, keeping secrets from parents. Certainly not every single school has been doing this, certainly not every teacher, of course, but many are, many have been. If you read my first book, Conflicted, you can read all the receipts. I saw this firsthand in Chicago public schools. So now, President Trump is saying that if any K-12 school teaches this type of curriculum, then they won't receive federal funding. So you see how funding allows governments to have control over education? This is what I'm talking about, funding. Now, many conservatives and Christians think this is great, this is awesome. Now, while I do agree that all the woke indoctrination should not be taking place, it's evil, I don't agree with the power that any one president has over education, even a president whose policies you might like. Because what happens when a new president is elected, or a new governor, or new Congress, and they do the exact opposite of what you like? Do we just go right back to complaining and repeat the whole cycle, all while the power of the federal government continues to grow? A single stroke of the president's pen should not determine what my child is taught, one way or another. The government has way too much say, way too much control as is, and with every new executive order, with every new law that's passed, that control only grows. So, while I do agree that wokeness is bad for our children, bad for our country, I do not agree that an all-powerful government is the solution. This is why I support what the 10th Amendment says, that the power of education should be reserved to the people. That's why I say no to school choice. I say no to government handouts and quote-unquote free money, because as the Bible teaches, educating children is the responsibility of the parents. Now, parents can delegate that responsibility as they see fit, but not as the government sees fit. Now, that's all I wanted to discuss in this episode. I hope that you guys found it worthwhile. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.